Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the conference organizers. Turns out shrimp isn't my only passion. So today I can tell you a little bit more about me and what I do before I get into my talk. So my name is Ashlee Lillis, and a few years ago I founded Sound Ocean Science, which is a nonprofit organization, and this was after experience in academia as a research scientist for a few years at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and as a postdoc, and then working directly in marine conservation as a program director with the Nature Conservancy. I saw a real disconnect between the rigorous science that is needed and the conservation part. So where I'm positioning myself and our organization now is doing fundamental science that supports conservation alongside conservation groups. And so I actually live in Zanzibar now, and I'm really focused on East Africa. But I'm going to talk about ecoacoustic monitoring and coral reef soundscapes kind of in general to begin with, and then get into some of the specific projects I'm working on. So let's see if this works. Okay, so I wanted to start by saying that over 96% of marine fish and invertebrate species have not been examined for sound production, though we think that most of them do produce sound. We have not characterized their sound. So this is kind of a huge challenge in the field that I'm talking about, and I'm just putting that out there from the beginning, and it will come up throughout this talk. And so here are a couple papers, reviews that came out in the last 2 years, kind of talking about this problem, and it's fun because I made this slide probably in 2022 about this, and now today we have Audrey and Miles, who are the first authors of these 2 papers, here to give talks. So I hope they're going to tell me about how they've solved this problem, and I don't have to worry about it anymore. But more on this later, and how myself, as a non-fish bioacoustician, is trying to help support the effort to solve the problem of our uncharacterized fish and invertebrate calls. So today, as I said, I'm going to kind of start by talking about why we study coral reef ecoacoustics. This is from the perspective of a benthic ecologist. So I started my career interested in seafloor ecosystems in general. I wasn't in acoustics until I was a PhD student and discovered the wonderful world of soundscapes. So I'm going to kind of talk about how we're approaching this from that perspective. What we know and don't know this is still a pretty early new field. So there's a lot we don't know, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we have gotten to know over the last 10 to 15 years that people have really been looking at coral reef soundscapes. And then I want to really put this in the context of East Africa reef soundscapes. That's where I've been focusing efforts for the last 4 or 5 years, is to collect some baseline data and really include that in the global data set. And then end back where we started with how can we identify and characterize reef sound sources, those interviews with fish, and how I entitled the talk. We're going to kind of bring that home as a kind of a up for discussion point. So there we are. So as I said, I'm a benthic ecologist, means I study seafloor ecosystems. I'm interested in a whole range of ecological processes that affect the health and status and community dynamics of a place like a coral reef or an oyster bed, what have you. And I actually mostly focus on larval dispersal and settlement. And so that isn't necessarily what you'd naturally think, like, okay, so what does this have to do with acoustics? But when I started listening about 15 years ago to these systems, oh, there's meant to be some sound there. Oh, there was, I just can't hear it. Let me go back. Okay, so the point I want to make is that actually once you start listening and realizing that all of these processes are embedded in an acoustic environment, you can imagine how they might be affected by acoustics, but also reflected in the soundscape. So not only is listening to the sounds of, especially underwater where vision isn't the best sense, you can appreciate that even me studying larval dispersal and settlement of oysters, my PhD dissertation showed that these oyster larvae are responding to the sounds of their habitats. And so that's kind of when I went down that shrimp hole and became really fascinated by just reef acoustics. So that means, the traditional marine passive acoustics, monitoring and bioacoustics was really focused on marine mammals, as we mostly know, often offshore. Maybe oceanographers were interested for other applications. And then, of course, you have to kind of have maybe good Navy funding or something like this to really be doing it. So invertebrate larval ecologists like me probably weren't really invited to the passive acoustic monitoring party until more recently, when low-cost monitoring tools that we'll talk about, I know there's some talks later about how these have been able to go into the marine system and enable us to do near-shore soundscape monitoring and really uncover a lot of unexplained variation. So I want to give just a brief overview of the sources that make up a marine soundscape. And when I talk about a soundscape, I mean the collection of all of the sounds that are associated with a particular habitat or location. So this can be physical and geological sounds, weather activity, geological activity. Unfortunately, humans are competing with the snapping shrimp for being the noisiest animal in the sea, and we are indeed putting a ton of acoustic energy into the sea. But all of our favorite sounds, of course, are the biological, and these can be produced intentionally or as byproducts of activity. So this is just a couple examples: reproduction, feeding, communication. There's a lot more activities that are producing sounds, as well as purposeful communication and sound production. And so I just want to play kind of a range of some of the sounds that we usually record when we're in a coral reef or other marine habitats. So this is the sound of a spiny lobster that's stridulating. Our friend the toadfish, who kind of sounds like he looks. We've got a lot of fish that do some sort of drumming or patterned sound production. And my colleague in New Zealand, where there's lots of sea urchins, has found that the sounds of sea urchins feeding, scraping algae off of rocks can be audible in the soundscape and detected. We have fish that kind of sound like pigs. This is the grunt. And then I said I wasn't going to talk about snapping shrimp, but they're there, so. Isn't it relaxing? Yeah. So as I said, about 10, 15 years ago, this technology to be able to record reefs became more available to our average ecologist, and this includes calibrated hydrophones that are still a little more expensive and produce high fidelity, good soundscape recordings underwater. This one here is called a sound trap, but there's other options for standalone, easy to deploy hydrophones. And then more recently, and we're having a talk, I think this afternoon, about the audio moths, with which many of the terrestrial soundscape or bioacousticians are familiar with. We have the hydro moth, which is basically just throwing an audio moth into a waterproof case. So I wouldn't call it a hydrophone. It's not actually built to record sound underwater, and I consider it more of like a signal detector. It's uncalibrated, but low cost, so we can put out a lot, and we're still figuring out how and what we can derive from that. So no matter what you use, basically you have to make decisions of how we're going to deploy these, right? And so doing reef ecoacoustics and kind of starting in a new field involves a lot of decisions, and we don't know what the best approach is, so I'm going to show some of the results of kind of trying different things. But basically, you're going to either put out stationary moorings or maybe have a mobile drifter with your hydrophone or recorder on it. And you're going to have to decide, what are the recording, the bandwidth that you're recording at, because if you're not targeting a specific sound, you're looking at the soundscape, then, really the sounds that are important could be across many frequencies. You might want to decide what type of environmental data you want to collect, temperature, light, other things that are important in order to correlate with your soundscape data. And then if you're putting them out for a long term, you really need to have a duty cycle in order to conserve battery and memory space, which means you might have to say, well, should I do 1 minute every 10 minutes, 1 minute every hour? And of course, this depends on your questions. But when I started doing this, at least, it was well, I want to characterize the soundscape. So that's not really a very specific question, right? But you still have to balance all of these things. And I'd say we're still trying to figure out the best way to do that. And then, of course, we need to figure out how to analyze these data. And as we go, there's many, many, many more analysis techniques being developed and advanced computing and all of that, which is really great. And so, we're using the same time series analyses, correlating sound metrics with environmental variables, really trying to explore what soundscapes mean. This is just some examples, from papers over the last 10 years of how we might look at different reefs, different habitats, but again, it depends on the questions. So this is just to say there's a lot of ways to characterize a soundscape. There's a lot of ways to look at ecoacoustics, which sort of brings me to, why are we doing it? What's the dream here, right? And so the idea is, especially if we could use these wonderful low-cost hydromoths and put a whole bunch out in a reef, get these acoustic recordings, and then have the soundscape patterns tell us, a lot about reef quality and function. And Xavier gave a talk yesterday afternoon online that talked about some of those acoustic metrics that are trying to be applied. Some of us want to look at fish and invertebrate diversity from soundscapes and understand the interrelationships. And I put marine mammals on there too, not because they live in coral reefs, but sometimes we can still record their sounds and make our marine mammal friends happy, or our marine mammal ecologists happy. And so I really do think, in my vision of this work and why it was exciting to me as a benthic ecologist is that there's something for everyone, right? The idea being that we can do fundamental research on the ecology of a system or a specific fish or, any type of interaction, predator-prey interactions, but also ideally apply this to conservation. And this can be across small scales, so at the reef level or a coral head level, all the way up to broad-scale comparisons that are being done now or attempting to do is to look globally, what are some of the patterns. Okay. So indeed, over the past 10 years, efforts have increased rapidly to apply soundscape monitoring to coral reefs. Probably even if you're studying mole rats, you know that coral reefs are very hot right now. Literally and figuratively, people are interested in their conservation and just knowing more about them. And so part of this work has been exploring coral reef biodiversity and monitoring through ecoacoustics. This is just a selection of the papers that have been coming out. But now I want to talk a little bit more about what I've found out about coral reef soundscape variation, and also highlight the challenges, limitations, and on the positive side, the opportunities that we have in this very recently begun field, really. So, the basic question maybe I did ask early on was, how do coral reef soundscapes vary? I was interested from that larval perspective because I'm thinking like a coral larva, if I want to find a reef, does it sound different than another reef? And so indeed, when we started to record different quality of reef in a broad spectrum, it was obvious that a high coral cover high diversity reef does sound different or does show different acoustic characteristics than a really low cover rubble sponge degraded reef. And so I'll just play you a short clip, but this is in the Caribbean. We've got our shrimp friends, as always, in the back, and some fish sounds here. And so this is pretty typical from a reef recording. And then I'm playing you the low coral cover degraded reef. And kind of as expected, there's fewer fish there. We don't find the fish sounds. And so, of course, we can see this in the spectrograms, that reefs do vary in sound levels, frequency content, and then acoustic complexity, and some of these indices you can apply. And sure, we'll find differences on these really broad ends of the spectrum. So these relationships to habitat composition and quality do exist. But if we dig a bit deeper, and we want to say our conservation organization, okay, you can do passive acoustic monitoring, super easy, put this out, you don't need to go do these visual surveys that are labor intensive, yada yada. We need to be sure that you can actually detect small changes, right? But unfortunately, or interestingly, there's a lot of small scale spatial and temporal variation. So I did a lot of drifter work because I wanted to know, partly, how do I decide where to put my hydrophone if I want to represent a whole reef, which is a whole other question, like what is a reef? Where does it start? Where does it end? And so by putting a hydrophone drifter across a reef like this one in the Virgin Islands, we actually saw quite dramatic changes in the soundscape across only 50 meters, 100 meters, a difference, up to 20 decibels. Of course, this is mostly influenced by our shrimp, which is, this hot spot of activity here shown in red, but also in lower bandwidths associated with fish sounds. So I guess what this showed me was the drifting method is kind of a good way to get a sense of some of the variation across the reef before you decide, I'm going to put a long-term hydrophone in this one place. But it also complicates this story of being able to monitor a reef tract or a whole reef patch acoustically if there's so much variation. Another time on an expedition in Cuba, we were able to measure depth variation and find a lot of small scale variation in the acoustic characteristics due to just a few meters of depth. So this, again, shows us we have to be really careful about where we put our hydrophone. This was 3 hydrophones a couple meters apart over a shallow reef system, and we have differences of up to 10 decibels in the sound depending on where you have your hydrophone. So these are sort of some of the challenges to reef soundscapes and working in shallow waters due to complex propagation of sound, variation probably in the instruments as well, and really, these types of papers that I've published are to show, let's be careful before we interpret ecologically soundscapes of coral reefs that are really understudied in terms of their sound propagation. And so lastly, before we shift into some of our East African examples, I want to talk about the use of acoustic metrics and fish calls as indicators, because this will come back up later. Basically, there's been a lot of effort to apply the terrestrial acoustic diversity metrics that have varying levels of success on land. They generally have very limited use underwater. Partly, it's a very different system, but we're not seeing that they reliably translate, which is a bummer because people really wanted to be able to say to their conservation practitioner, here's your metric. We're trying to get to an acoustic diversity of 8 in your restoration project or whatever, but so far that's not really seen. But what we do see is that one of the best relationships between soundscape data, between the acoustic characteristics, is often with fish sounds. So counting of fish sounds or using some fish sounds does seem to relate to the habitat quality or the health of a coral reef. You can see in this paper by Tim Lamont, I think it was from 2023, they were comparing a reef that was completely destroyed to a reef that they restored. And so again, I would argue these are like very far ends of the spectrum, but they were able to say that the restoration success was detectable in the soundscape. But the only metric that really was different was the calls of 10 fish. And you can see here that these are labeled just by what they sound like. Growl, foghorn, laugh, whoop. We don't know at all. They're completely unidentified fish. So to me, you know, as a community ecologist, I really want to know what fish might be producing those sounds. If we're going to say that this community is restored, or that this is representing a restored coral reef, it seems pretty important that we understand, I mean, this could all be the same fish. Probably not, but we have no idea. You could argue that, you know, one fish even could be beside the hydrophone making a lot of this sound. So it's been a bit unsatisfying. You know, these are really good that we're characterizing these sounds, even if we can't identify them, but there's a lot of work to do. And so this is a second recent paper. I think this even came out last week by my colleagues at Woods Hole. This is the group I worked with 10 years ago. And they are also finding that these unidentified fish sounds are good indicators of coral reef health. But what are they? So hopefully Audrey is going to help us figure that out later. No, I'll talk about that at the end of my talk as well. Okay, so here we are back to the dream. I've shown you a bit of the variation. You get a sense of some of what we're up against, especially those of you who don't work in the marine system. This might be new, or you didn't know that we had such challenges. And so I think the reality is we're really still working at it, which is great. I mean, I like a challenge. I'm here to study the 600 unknown species of shrimp, as well as the 96% of fish that are making sounds that we don't know. So we're really here, and I like to point this out, mostly because I work directly with conservation practitioners on the ground, and I'm there saying, hey, let's put these recorders out, but I want to be very clear always that this isn't going to, you know, solve your problem. It's very much exploratory research that has the promise for future application, but we're not there yet. And so I think that's important, because sometimes we see a scientific paper get translated into the media as like, all we have to do is listen to the reef and everything is fine. And I think that's not true at all. So I'm just gonna give a summary of what I basically just told you about the challenges and limitations or opportunities for growth. So we're still at a point where we really lack standardized data collection and analysis protocols, and partly that's because, as I said, different questions, you're going to take a different approach. But when we're just trying to, if we're trying to characterize a reef for conservation purposes, it would be good if there's at least some guidance, and this is being developed across, like on a global scale. There's soundscape ecologists, marine soundscape ecologists providing kind of these frameworks for analysis and data collection. But specifically for reefs, I think we need this kind of even just decision tree of like what you're trying to do. How should you start? How should you do a pilot study to determine where you're then going to do your recordings, et cetera? You know, and this really, like we saw, there's an absence of ecoacoustic indices. People are working on them, but partly we need good protocols of collection and analysis before we could really apply these indicators in a convincing way anyway. And then the big open question is the lack of validation or characterization of fish and invertebrate sounds. So I'll be talking about that a little bit later, and so will other speakers. And then the limited like this is very closely related, but even for the animals that we do know, like a snapping shrimp, that they're making the sound, we really don't know a lot about why they're making these sounds, what the behavioral context is, and all of those things that a lot of us want to know. So again, foundational bioacoustics and ecological knowledge is still needed to establish the use of passive acoustic monitoring for reef conservation applications. So there's something for everyone. And okay, I'm just saying these are all interrelated, obviously, and need to be done in parallel, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the AI and machine learning that's being applied in this field as well. And I'm someone who thinks always both, always everything all at once, so that we can eventually get towards that dream. And I'm not a computing expert, I'm not a fish bioacoustics expert, but I think that we all have a role to play in collecting data, increasing knowledge in different ways. So something for everyone. So now I want to zero in on East Africa reef soundscapes, and I guess with all of this, I would say, there's all these challenges, and just like I don't think we should stop and say, okay, well, we can't do it. I think one of the keys is to increase our geographical coverage and also explore and relish in that variation. A lot of my earlier work was with the thought that, okay, I just need to record this reef and then do my other thing about the larvae, the study that I wanted to do. And instead it became like, oh, but we know nothing about reefs in terms of their soundscape. So in the same way, I think that uncovering all of that variation is part of the key to being able to at least know what we don't know. And so I've been working in Mozambique and Zanzibar to at least collect baseline reef data and explore that variation. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. So I began in 2019 as a Nat Geo explorer in Mozambique in a biodiversity hotspot called Bazaruto Archipelago, and really just wanted to collect some of the first marine soundscape data in that region. And so I'll give a little bit of info on that shortly. And then Zanzibar, where I'm based now, there are a lot of coral conservation and restoration projects, and I've been adding ecoacoustics to that, not to solve their monitoring issue, but to alongside develop these methods. So first, Bazaruto Archipelago, as I said, we started in 2019. And this really wasn't reef specific. There are a ton of different habitats in this archipelago off the coast of Mozambique, including seagrass, rocky bottoms. And so that's a really nice system to look at the differences between different habitats. And really, this objective over a couple years was to provide that baseline soundscape data that someone later would be able to use. It's data that's openly available from an understudied region. And so basically the approach was to take a lot of recordings, and I had learned by this time that we need to have a lot of spatial coverage before you would be able to then implement any type of monitoring program long term. And so this is a map of the archipelago, and all of those dots are places where we did at least short-term recordings, some multiple days, and then we picked a couple reefs where we recorded for over a year. This amounted to a lot of data, and found the usual patterns. I'm not going to go into the details of this today, but just wanted to tell you that these data exist now, and it's kind of an example of what we're doing while we still don't know the high fish acoustic diversity that was found. We don't know what they are, but someday, hopefully, we will. And it adds to that global network of soundscape ecologists, reef soundscape ecologists, to say, are these different fish? So we're working on that. These are just some of the power spectra showing different habitat types and how we could then at least have baseline characterization of which frequencies are represented. Unsurprisingly, you'll recognize the sound of a reef by the snapping shrimp and some little fish parts here and there. And like other studies, we have unexplained or unidentified fish calls. That was one. Here's another one. And these would be very, very common throughout all of our recordings. These sites off of Mozambique are extremely acoustically active in terms of fish, so it's a really nice data set for us to start trying to do some of these fish analyses. And this work continues. So this year, the partner organization, the Bazaruto Center for Scientific Studies, has deployed hydrophones again as part of their Western Indian Ocean Observatory. And I feel like even this is a huge success, because when I first contacted them, they had never heard of ecoacoustics or recording as part of it. And I had said, hey, let's add these to your observatory. So they'll be collecting lots of other environmental data alongside the acoustic data, which is really nice to see and to keep working with them. And so I'll switch to Zanzibar, where, as I said, I'm based now. And again, these efforts are mostly to educate the partners as well as take baseline data, but not to say, we're going to tell you something really profound about your reefs. And so I'm working with the Chumbe Island Coral Park, which is a really wonderful community-run conservation area, MPA, with ecotourism, very small-scale ecotourism in Zanzibar. I highly recommend it. They have a beautiful, beautiful tiny reef that's protected. And so one thing that was really nice about this project that was just short-term collecting soundscape data was to share it with the community there so that they could appreciate the reef in a different way. Lots of them don't snorkel, don't engage in person, but when they hear the sounds and hear about this, then they kind of see it in a different light. So this is a map. We're here off of the coast of Tanzania, a tiny island, 1 kilometer long, and this is kind of another example of looking at small-scale variation. So often in the past, or originally when people maybe didn't have as many instruments as well, they'd say, okay, well, we're gonna put out 1 hydrophone, and that covers 1 kilometer, no problem, right? But I took recordings basically, a couple 100 meters apart, and did a short-term comparison of that. And we did see quite a few differences. These are just some pictures of our guide deploying the hydrophone and some of the beautiful coral, which unfortunately has bleached this year. So come see coral reefs while they still exist. Yeah, so the result was, even 200 meters apart, we do see quite a bit of difference, and it kind of highlights why it's important to do this type of baseline data collection if you're going to try to implement any acoustic monitoring. This is the sound in the north of their 1 kilometer reef tract. They had major bleaching maybe 5 years before that, and not as high quality reef. Let's see. And so we expected it to be different. Indeed, not a lot of fish sound. 200 meters away, you can hear the shrimp. I'm sure you can also hear the whales. And so I thought this was a really neat example of how we might pick up that type of more offshore, off the coast activity, but not consistently. And so I think a lot of even acousticians, especially acoustical oceanographers, consider, like, they don't really think that much about shallow water propagation, sometimes like with so much variation, and some here might be able to tell me I'm wrong, and that's fine, but my understanding is, the propagation model would be like, oh, it spreads evenly, everything is saturated, but when I record, there's obviously things going on that's not the case. And so if you did want to record the passing humpback whales, you'd want to be in the middle of the island, I suppose, is what we found. And then outside of the marine protected area, interestingly, I actually found more fish sounds than inside the marine protected area. So again, we don't know exactly what that means, but if we're going to start to say, fish sound is the indicator of healthy reef, I think we need to know what that fish is. That's like saying insect sound or bird sound is the sign of something, and it's actually just crows or just, one type. So I think this is a nice example and baseline data set. The other group I'm working with now is doing coral farming on the east coast of Zanzibar, and they have a really nice site for us to do some of this experimental work. You can see here they have different structures that they're basically building little coral patches. And so I've been putting the audio moths on these, and this is just in the last few months even, so I don't have a lot to share yet other than to say these data exist, and if anyone wants to collaborate on them, I already have a couple collaborators from this meeting that are interested in it. But yeah, I'm basically developing this as an experimental site. You see here that sadly there was a bleaching event this year, which is obviously a big challenge for the coral and an opportunity for us to see if we can detect in the soundscape any changes. Did this affect any of those sound producers? And evaluate whether or not coral health can actually be detected in the soundscape in any way. So yeah, data sharing is a big part of my ethos in general and for this project. So Isla at WOPAM and the Cornell Lab is going to take some of these data this week and hopefully analyze or help analyze them as well. So stay tuned. Maybe at the 2026 conference, I'll be talking more about our results of coral reef soundscapes in Zanzibar. And so before I end this section, I just wanted to point out that a lot of these soundscape data are going to partners like Conservation Metrics, Cornell, and making it so that there's some reef soundscape data from Africa. So Sound Ocean Science collections contributed to 2 out of 3 of the data sets that were used in this recent paper looking at applying machine learning and classification to reef soundscape analysis. So I was really happy that we could have that geographical coverage. And like I said, even if I can't say much about the reef soundscapes now, or it's kind of like, we don't really know what this means yet, at least contributing to the development of computing tools is happening. But I want to point out, again, we've heard the last couple days about how, okay, AI isn't going to solve all the problems. We're all familiar with that. And this, to me, this paper that I'm part of is kind of an example of that, because I look at then what they've done, which is totally understandable, but there's only 2 classes of sound as part of this analysis, and so I kind of think, so what? Like, I can't really do much with this. And then even the Mozambique data, I think it's 6 classes, but none are to species or even really to a specific taxa. So if you're, someone who wants to derive real data on fish populations from this, I don't think we're there yet, which is fine. So the promise of machine learning obviously still depends on confirming sound sources, and that's what I'm going to wrap up my talk talking about. And this is just another example, I think, that was published very recently, again, and looked at how they could use unsupervised clustering to delineate all these different pulsed calls. And basically, it's another example of, like, this is really cool and great, but we have no idea who's making any of these sounds. So let's talk about that. Towards the dream of ecoacoustics and this little diagram of all of the cool things that we want to do, I do really hope and I believe the computers, or maybe I naively believe the computers are going to help a lot, and I'm excited about that, so I want to contribute to it by collecting these data that they can apply. But I still think, you know, in concert, in tandem with that, the fundamental bioacoustics and ecology has to be happening. And so I'm really happy because that's something that I can do, whereas I don't know how to do AI. So let's talk about that. How can we identify and characterize reef sound sources? What is being done? And I consider this really an open question, and I'm super happy to hear from the audience and people who have done this on land and maybe think like, okay, if I were underwater, how would I do this? Let's talk about it. And so again, back to this, so over 96% of marine fish and invertebrate species have not been examined for sound production, but we think that they have the anatomical and physiological ability to produce sound and probably do at least as a byproduct, if not intentionally. So why is that? Well, it's pretty obvious. You know, we haven't been underwater as much as we spend in our own habitat, so it's harder. Species are also cryptic, nocturnal, and in complex habitat, though that's true on land as well, so there is hope. Visual validation, even when these species aren't as cryptic, is pretty limited. So our hydrophones are picking up sounds from, you know, a kilometer away, hundreds of meters away. That means that just having a camera isn't necessarily going to help. Propagation conditions vary, as I said, so you're not always going to be able to pinpoint where the sounds are coming from. And then, most of all, or like importantly, observers actually interfere with not only the behaviors, but we are actually making so much noise. So often if we're in the ocean, whether it be in an ROV or scuba diving, we're producing a lot of noise. So these are some of the issues. I'm going to just quickly go through a few of the ways that people have been able to characterize that 4% of the sounds, which is captive recordings, of course. And there's a really good group in French Polynesia that's done a lot of that for reef fish. But, you know, it has its own limitations. We know tank affects the way sound is propagated. Maybe it's not exactly the natural sound production that we could compare to the wild, but still really important. And then in situ video audio technology has been developed. There was a really great paper and PhD dissertation from Xavier Moy at University of Victoria of using a pretty low cost, easy to deploy system that's all open source, you know, trying to make it accessible, and using that array. So this also doesn't solve all the problems. You've got a camera, its own, like, you can even see in his picture, he's working not in a coral reef and not in clear water, but, you know, it's something. It's better than nothing. And Fisheye Acoustics is also a company that's trying to develop technology, or has developed it. It's not really, that's kind of opposite. It's not open source, though they have a nonprofit now that I think is trying to do more work. So as someone who likes a challenge and wants to throw together some cameras and hydrophones on a piece of PVC, I've done a little bit of this myself, and so I just want to show. This is a really sad-looking reef in the Caribbean, but this is how they look. And we can at least quite easily identify that there's a sound associated with the parrotfish feeding. It's an example of, you know, like I've thrown together, like literally in my spare time, going out and at least getting like a little bit of data. But you can imagine, I mean, this is a degraded reef with not a lot of fish. There's still a ton of different species all around. So it's not easy to figure out who's making what sound. That's why having an array of hydrophones is important, but also sounds could be coming from behind and all over. So I'm going to let the experts mostly develop that technology, but still I think there's a place for people like me who maybe are going to just go out with their camera and collect some data. Well, and Audrey later can say whether that's true or not, because she's collecting all of the sounds into a database. And so the other part where some of us who are more in the field all the time can be of help is through actual observations as closed circuit rebreather or freediver. Freedivers. So this means not conventional scuba that produces bubbles, because otherwise you're making too much noise to be able to detect signals. And so recently, or I guess it was 2 years ago now, I was trained as a closed circuit rebreather diver and started doing what I consider interviews with fish. So actually following fish around with a hydrophone and a rebreather, which was actually done first in Hawaii in 2014. There's one paper, and then nobody has ever continued to do this type of characterization of fish sounds. But I still hope to. So this is just, I don't know if it's going to. So this is just a comparison, especially if you're not a diver, you might not know how much noise diving makes. It's just turning it off. Okay, so it's much more relaxing if you're using the rebreather. And so the hope is, and I've seen it at least anecdotally and firsthand, that at the same site, a lot more animals come directly. You see a lot more sharks and fish that are scared off by the sounds. So the idea being that you might be able to get more of those sounds. So I've actually mostly switched, though, to doing freediving observations. It's cheaper and more available. I can't actually do rebreather diving in East Africa. There's just not the facilities. It is like a technical diving. But I realized, I could become a good freediver, maybe, or at least put out cameras in places. So this is just another example of a very simple thing I did, in 5 minutes. Saw these fish and was like, I wonder what they're saying. And so this is a species that's well known already, or there's a few examples of their sounds, but I would argue that having more examples in more places is better, right? I mean, all of you who study the specific calls of different animals know that there's going to be variation probably. We should train our computers to recognize them with a lot of different data. So this is where, and you can see, even with the GoPro recording, I'm able to see what the sound looks like graphically. So I think it's a real simple way to do it. And that's why I kind of want to end on this question. Can we include more communities? Is that one of the ways that we can try to solve this problem? So we've got aquarium hobbyists that might be able to do some of these captive recording type approach. We have free divers, snorkelers, underwater filmmakers. They actually do use rebreathers often to try to capture those amazing National Geographic, style behaviors. Can these people act as citizen bioacousticians? I think so, because I consider in this way, I have no acoustic knowledge, but I'm still doing it just on the side. So that's kind of where I want to leave it, is that if we hope to identify and characterize more reef sound sources, I do think, efforts need to be increased from that side, and involving communities that maybe are not scientists and using creative approaches. I don't think we're going to get them all. I think there's a lot, just like the shrimp, a lot of these animals are living inside and among and not going to find them, but we can certainly improve our sound libraries. And so I'm back to this slide, which I want to highlight again the fundamental bioacoustics and ecology, and then our computing friends. I think we're going to work wonderfully together moving forward towards the dream of using soundscapes to understand reef ecology. And I want to put this up too, that I really think and I hope that there will be more of these little sound waves all around Africa. It's an understudied place for reef acoustics. I know we have a talk soon, maybe this morning or this afternoon, about Sodwana Bay, so that's really exciting. But yeah, I'm happy to collaborate with anyone who wants to do some coral reef acoustics in their backyard as well. So with that, I want to thank you all for the attention, and also all of the collaborators and funders of this body of work. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ashlee.
And I'll take questions.
Hello, yeah. Thank you very much for that very cool talk. Yeah, very awesome fieldwork as well, and it's great to hear that you're collaborating already. That's awesome. So yeah, has anyone got any questions?
Actually, that was really interesting. Thank you. That was really, really cool. I always thought that coral reefs is quite a daunting prospect as a bioacoustician, because they're global, but also there's the threats there as well. I know you're kind of early doors with it, I suppose, in a way, but you have been doing it also for a very long time. And with the availability of low-cost recorders has really changed what you're able to do. What, in terms of your I want to say your focus, is it mainly just like healthy reefs, what you can, where you have access to, or is there a conscious bias there towards those that are threatened, or that, okay, let's get baseline data because I can see the next couple of years this is where fishing will increase, or MPAs are threatened, that sort of thing, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. And I think it kind of hits on the challenge of being more, I consider myself a fundamental ecologist, or someone who's curiosity-driven and wants to just learn about these places, but in the face of destruction and devastation that's ongoing. And part of the reason I moved to Zanzibar is I thought that the reef was healthier and going to be healthier for longer, and I see already in the year I've been there so much damage being done. So I guess, yeah, it's balancing the two. I'm not focused necessarily on healthy reefs, and I do want to be doing something meaningful, not just scientifically, even though I think doing just the science for science is amazing, and what I would prefer there not to be any need for conservation, but there is. So yeah, I think that's why I want to work alongside the small NGOs, the local practitioners, cognizant of what their questions are, what would help them continue to do their work. And luckily, as I said, I think it all overlaps. So I don't have to study all doom and gloom stuff. I can get excited about just interviewing the fish, and maybe that's why I am pulled to do that in a way, is because otherwise it's kind of a bummer just to record the death of the system that you're studying, right? We were talking about that yesterday, that like I'm happy to be recording this data now, even if we can't fully understand it, except my fear is in 20 years it will just show how much better things were now than they are going to be in 20 years. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but...
Simon?
Hi, Ashlee. Thanks. That was a really cool talk. I think we talked a bit about some of these challenges of fine-scale differences, and I really appreciate your approach of going from the machine learning and putting the data into those studies, but also tackling it on a fish-by-fish basis. But just looking at your recorders, to me, they're like right in the reef. Like, we work on whales, so we always want to get a little bit further out and step further back. Which make me wonder, I haven't worked much in the fish space and the reef space, but I'm drifting into it. Are there standards sort of being discussed, maybe if anyone else in the room knows, on sort of how close should you be to a study site for a reef? Because to me, if you're going to be that close, it's sort of, the equivalent of you start getting this noise. Should we be 1 meter back, 10 meters back? And should we be doing more of these studies where we swamp that reef with a hydrophone every 10 meters up and every 10 meters across for 6 days?
Yeah. No, this is an important question, and I think that's mostly, part of my point of showing those type or doing those studies is a lot of people haven't necessarily and kind of guessed early on, like, oh, well, we're going to go 50 meters away from the reef edge as a characterization of this reef. But we've done also a lot of, I think what you're talking about is kind of deploying hydrophones on a transect away from the reef to see before you put your long-term recorder out. I think that's the important, for me, the recommendation is like know what you're trying to be able to ask, because it just depends. I think some of the other speakers might know, or people who are part of the GLUBs and like bigger efforts worldwide would know if they've come up with anything, but my understanding is that there's not a well-known guideline. It just depends. What's the bathymetry there? What's the question? I agree. I guess I'm trying specifically to do what you say, like put it in there and see how different it can be if I'm beside this grouper patch versus this other one, right? I'm getting like kind of reveling in that variation, but I think that's not helpful necessarily to set a guideline for anyone else. It's just showing that it's hard.
Thank you, Ashlee. Any other questions?
Sorry, we just have a few questions online. So Prabjit asks, is there a repository of sound of coral and of corals and fishes that we can explore? And is it possible to obtain the repertoire of some of these fishes and species in captive settings? And then how well do they represent their calls in the natural environment?
And so maybe that question was asked before I talked about captive recordings, but I'll respond to it. But first with the repositories, yes, there are a couple, and I should have put them in there. Audrey's going to be talking about the one that she managed and developed called Sounds.net. So check that out. That has a lot, like a compilation of things. There's also a website called Discovery of Sound in the Sea, docets.org, and they have a pretty good audio library showcasing the different types of sounds, kind of more like what I showed you, is like, here's some of the types. Whereas Fish Sounds they're all like published records, detailed calls. And then for the other question, yes, captive recordings, of course, have a place in all of this, but depending on the sound and the reflections and the size of the tank, acoustically can be not necessarily representative of what might be recorded in a natural environment. That said, they still can give us good information about at least the frequency range and patterning and things like that. So I think we need to continue. I'm hoping to go over to the aquarium here and ask them if they'll record some fish. So yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you, Ashlee. I wanted to ask, when I look at the images you've shown and the sounds of the coral reef, it looks like this microcosm of activity, of acoustic activity, and it gets me thinking about spatiotemporal interactions, acoustic interactions, and particularly in the snapping shrimp as well. And I wonder to what extent there's been any effort to try to characterize that using something like an acoustic camera or something that you see everything going off at the same time, or how it's all arranged.
Yeah, I think there's been very little in reefs. I know with regard specifically to the snapping shrimp that an acoustic camera has been used to map a wharf using just the snapping shrimp sound, and it was like accurate because the wharf was all embedded with snapping shrimp. I think that would be an amazing idea. I vaguely recall maybe one study trying to do this, but that's kind of exactly would be the next step with like my drifter studies. I found so fascinating because, like you said, like even within maybe 100-meter reef patch where a lot of people have treated that as uniform, we know it's not. And so there's a lot going on that might be able to come out of it. I have a colleague, I'm going to co-supervise a PhD student who's working on snapping shrimp, and I believe they're going to do some of that kind of acoustic camera work in the Great Barrier Reef to at least figure out where the snapping concentrations are. Good question.
Any other questions?
Okay. Thanks, Ashlee. That was fascinating. I was wondering if there's been any work done looking at how temperature of the sea might change how these recordings are picked up, and I guess particularly in light of looking at monitoring change over time, and if the sea temperature is changing over time as well, how that might affect the recordings.
Mm-hmm. You mean the actual acoustic propagation, or I think it'll be a combination of things. And luckily, in terms of environmental variables that we're monitoring alongside the acoustic recordings, it's often temperature is at least our basic one, right? So we can really look already at tight relationships, especially with the snapping shrimp, which are this background sound in these habitats. We see close correlations just with their sound production with temperature. So we do anticipate that as temperature increase, that we would expect the noise floor to also increase in these places, which could have impacts then on fish communication or other animals. So that's kind of on the biological side, and then on the acoustic side, I think it's such a complex, shallow water environment. I would have to think harder about how just like a change of 0.5 degree might affect the sound propagation itself and whether it gets noisier. Yeah, good question.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have now for questions. Thank you very much again. That was wonderful. Cool. And we're back here at 10:15.